Good morning, and thank you, Colin, for getting us started here. Today, I am going to talk about the long road to stage zero. So I'm Janine Castro. I'm a geomorphologist by training. I lead a fabulous group of biologists at the Columbia River Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office in Vancouver, Washington. And we do a lot of work with fish passage and restoration. And I've been involved in restoration for about 30 years. So I'm going to kind of take us back and talk about what has been a long road to stage zero. I think many people think, oh, the stage zero idea just popped up all of a sudden, and it's this radical approach. And for those of us who've been kind of working in this area for many years, it certainly doesn't feel like it happened all of a sudden. And you'll hear from some other folks about that here in the rest of the day. So, long road to stage zero. You've heard from Colin back in 2013, this idea of the stream evolution model. And I'm going to just be referring back to the stages of channel evolution. I'm really going to stream evolution, I should say. And I'm going to be focusing on stage zero on the practitioner side. So there was kind of the theoretical underpinnings that Colin went through, and I'm going to talk about how the kind of practice and the theory came together. And I did want to acknowledge Johan Hogevorst as kind of a co-author on this talk, but many other people have helped us put this together over the years. And the reason this is important for us at Fish and Wildlife Service is obviously because of the habitat. We are trying to restore these systems. We're really focused on fisheries recovery, and that's why this is, I think, a lot of people have been paying attention. So let's go back to the 1980s. I'd like to call this kind of early channel restoration, and you could argue whether or not this was restoration, but we were doing things like placing gabions, where there are baskets filled with rock and tires. You can see those in there. Putting log sills, very simple engineered structures, cabling things in place. But unfortunately, this was prior to the stream evolution model and this idea of what the habitat looks like. So what we were doing is really holding these systems in stages 3 and 4, that arrested degradation, or I think what Colin referred to as kind of the ugly part of the stream evolution model. And you can see the habitat associated with that. Now, if we go forward to the 1990s, I would still call this channel-focused restoration. So this is some early work from the Forest Service, starting to use large wood. So for those of you who've been around a while, you'll probably remember when we started placing large wood back in streams. This was this kind of huge shift in restoration from using rock primarily to incorporating wood. Very controversial at the time, and now we do it as just a matter of practice. So what was wrong with this kind of channel-focused restoration approach? Well, again, for many of the channels we were working in, they were in stage 3 and 4. We were putting logs along the banks to slow down erosion. So we were essentially halting the stream evolution process and keeping it in a state that didn't provide much habitat, keeping in mind that most of our work in the Pacific Northwest of the US, and I'm sure in Canada as well, is focused on salmon recovery. So it really was not meeting our goals, but certainly was a step forward. And moving into the 2000s, I would argue we're still focused on the channel. We were putting a lot more wood in, spanning the channel, working more at the reach scale, which is a big improvement. But I had plenty of folks tell me if that wood was not in the channel, in the water, it would not help fish. And that concept has really changed over the years. So I think we did move forward a little bit with this channel-focused restoration, more at the reach approach, maybe stages 5 and 6. So an improvement, habitat's getting better, but it has not met the potential. There was still a lot more that we could do. So if we go a little bit further forward, about that same time, we started talking a lot more about wet meadow restoration. And there was starting to be a recognition that floodplains, what we were calling wet meadows, had value. And how do we reconnect them? So you can see in Bailey Creek as the example, this stream had been channelized. And in the figure on the right, or the aerial photo on the right, you can see the single thread meandering channel that Colin was talking about that was designed to bank full. But what we were finding in these types of projects is that we would design these channels to be transport channels, activate the floodplain at about a 1.5 year flow event, and guess what? We didn't get wet meadows. They were fairly dry surfaces. They were inundated infrequently. And so our goal was a wet meadow, essentially a wetland next to the river or the stream, and we weren't getting it. So on Bailey Creek, I really have to acknowledge the Forest Service for trying out new things, being willing to just experiment. So in this small reach on Bailey Creek, they undersized the channel and they made it smaller. And I remember having all these discussions about, well, how much do we undersize it? Do we make it 50% of bankable? Do we make it 30%? And we kept downsizing these channels, and we still were thinking, it's not small enough. We were getting at this idea that a bankful channel was too big without really having kind of that theory behind it, but why? And this is the experimentation that was going on. And then I like to think of this as a happy accident. On Karnowski Creek, which is this really fantastic restoration project, you can see designed as a single thread, highly meandering channel. And the happy accident was actually not in Karnowski, but in a tributary. So you can see this small channel that was designed in this tributary. And for the geomorphologists out there, or folks who've worked in rivers for a while, this might look like an alluvial fan, and it definitely is. So on Karnowski, on this tributary, project went in, and here we are in September of 2003, and they cut this fairly small channel through that kind of alluvial fan surface. And about 3 months later, is always the case, I think, they had a big flow event. And it brought in a lot of sediment and dropped out in the channel. And that channel essentially was filled in. And so the designer's like, oh my gosh, we had this failure. The channel filled up, and this is not what we expected. And they thought it was a problem. But then the fish biologist went out there and said, wait a minute, this looks like fantastic habitat. This is what we want. We want more of this. So here we are in 2004, like, okay, well, how do we do this? What would this look like in design and implementation? And here we are in 2017, essentially in a stage 0 condition. So it recovered basically from that event, filled in that channel. It was left. We didn't go in and maintain it or dredge that channel out, and it evolved into a stage 0 channel. So this was kind of, again, what I like to think about is the happy accident that fortunately I think we learned from, and the fish biologist certainly pointed out the value of these more anabranching streams. So here we are, and this one again is at stage 0. So during this period, kind of 2004, really to the present, I like to think of stage 0 expansion in terms of the way that we think about streams, the way we think about restoration, and you can even think about this as the pre and post Clure and Thorn period. Because in practice, we were trying things out. We recognized we weren't getting the connectivity with the floodplain that we wanted, and there was a lot of experimentation going on. But how did we go from the happy accident at Karnowski Creek to a project like Camp Polk on Weiches Creek, which you'll hear more about? And you'll hear about a number of projects. So the one on the top, kind of an outcome of something that really wasn't planned, to a project where we really did, the intention was stage 0, and that was part of the design and implementation. And that happened through a lot of small steps. It wasn't like one day we just went out and said, hey, we'll just go out into this big river system and we're just going to reconnect everything. Like so many things, it took many, many small steps and a lot of learning. So I just want to show a few examples of those small steps. So here you have an example of a stream that, it eroded, incised. It's a gully, starting to work in areas where there weren't fish populations, so low risk, higher in the watershed. And the Forest Service went in and they would just fill in these channels, bring the water surface, the groundwater back up to the surface, and distribute flow across that area. Here's another example. You can see the folks in there for scale. You've got a gully. They filled it in, put some wood for roughness on the surface, and then they've got this kind of multi-threaded, kind of reconnected meadow system. And here we've got just one more example of what that looks like. So lots of these projects are monitored over time to see how they responded. And that's where these trials were happening. So again, this didn't just happen all at once. But I want to kind of slow down for a moment and talk about 5 Mile Bell. I think you're going to be hearing more about this project, so I'm not going to tell you all the details, but I want to tell you the story of Paul Burns and 5 Mile Bell, which is kind of on the central coast of Oregon. And you can see Paul's out there standing in this incised channel that had cattle removed from it for many years. It was not recovering. It was stuck in arrested degradation. This is a stage 3 channel. It was not recovering on its own. So the plan was a single thread meandering channel. The nice thing about 5 Mile Bell, many, many phases over a decade. So this really was the laboratory of trying some of these new techniques. So cutting in that new channel, reconnecting it to the floodplain surface, initially started out as a single thread channel. And we had this challenge in design because as the design was being kind of evolved and we were looking at that single thread, parts of that floodplain had subsided. So as we brought that transport channel kind of coming down, the bed of the channel was above the floodplain surface. And so we thought, well, we're going to have to truck in soil to create banks because we're going to have a perched channel. How do we do this? And we were very fortunate that our local kind of regulatory folks who deal with the Endangered Species Act, we talked to them and said, would it be okay if we didn't have a channel? We just brought the channel down, we opened it up into a wetland area, and then at the bottom end of this wetland area, it would kind of come back into a channel. And fortunately, the folks in the regulatory office were comfortable with that. And they said, yeah, let's go ahead and try this out, see what it looks like. And it is the first time in my kind of 30-year career in restoration that we were allowed to not have a channel. And that was a big turning point. And also working closely with our regulatory partners, monitoring the site, the evolution that started out as a single thread transport channel, which then evolved to a stage 0 project. And so a lot of learning went on there, still being monitored, and we're getting a lot of good information, a lot of data out of this site. So I'm just very appreciative for all of Paul's work over the years on that. And all of that work kind of culminated in 2018 by a paper from Paul Powers, Matt Hellstadt, and Sunise Goda, and you'll hear from Paul here in a little bit, on a process-based approach. So one of the things that I can credit myself for in this whole process is that in 2013, the Clure and Thorn paper came out. And one of the folks with the Forest Service, and I think it was Kate Meyer maybe, came across the paper and said, hey, I found this paper. Stage 0, that is what we're doing. We are doing stage 0 projects. They were doing this type of work, but it didn't really have a name. And so she came across this paper, she shared it with the group, and then they started calling these projects stage 0. So I happened to know both Colin and Brian, and I called them up and said, hey, you know what? The Forest Service is up here, they're doing projects, they're calling these projects stage 0. You should come and see them. So this was the intersection of the theory and the practice. And the really wonderful thing about the work that is going on is this coming together of theory and practice, having the researchers working hand in hand with the practitioners. And that's one of the reasons I think that this approach has gotten a lot of attention, is because of the synergy between research and practice. So with that, I'm going to wrap up just with a few slides, this idea of stage 0. And sometimes depending on your audience, and maybe many of you out there are like, why stage zero? Now that you've heard from Colin, I think you understand where the term comes from. But if you're talking to a landowner or you're talking to a different interest group, maybe that's not the right terminology. But I think as we've described it, stage zero, there are some conditions that are really required to meet that stage zero condition. It doesn't have to be multiple channels. It could be multiple channels. As I just mentioned, it might be no channels, or it could be one channel. But there need to be kind of wetland plants, those obligate plants. The water table, for me, this is one of the most important things. It needs to be at or near the surface so that the local water table associated with the river or stream. And as Colin mentions, it needs to be a depositional environment, that response reach where material is building up. And for those of you who are uncomfortable with the term aggradation as kind of the filling up of the channel, think about floodplain accretion. We're talking about depositional features that are essentially some of the most productive landforms that we have out there for agriculture, where people like to live and so forth. So again, wetland plants, water table at or near the surface, and a depositional environment. On the flip side, a disconnected floodplain system would be more upland plants, terrestrial species, increased depth to water table, and often a transport environment. You can call that stage zero, or you could call it just a connected floodplain system. And I think that's where we started off this morning. You could also call it a multi-thread channel wetland complex. And this is what Damien and Jared, who you'll hear from today, in their paper, that's what they referred to it as, which I think really kind of captures the characteristics that we've been talking about. Or you call it a river wetland corridor. And this is a paper that Ellen Wohl and a number of us were involved with. That's what we decided to call it. So there's lots of different terminology, but I think we all agree on the characteristics that we're looking at for these very well-connected systems that provide those habitat features and functions that we're looking for. That kind of the goal of many of these projects. And I just wanted to show an example out of the paper with Ellen Wohl and a number of the co-authors, which I'll show you here in a moment. A lot of folks say, well, streams are just meandering. That's what we see on the landscape. And Colin mentioned the Walter and Merritt's paper that showed that actually was not the kind of ubiquitous condition. But there are remnants, and we call these contemporary remnants of these stage zero multi-threaded systems, and we find them all over the world. And there aren't a lot left because with a lot of our land drainage programs, we got rid of these because we wanted to use the agricultural land. We wanted to build our homes there. But they are out there. If you look around, you start seeing them, as Brian and Colin did when they were flying around the West. So I think seeing those examples is really helpful. And to wrap things up, I'm going to give you some references here and just kind of through time. So if we go back to 2013, that was the Clore and Thorne paper. Clearly, there were papers before that, which they built upon. But starting in 2013, they came out with their paper. A few years later, I will point you to a paper by Hauer and others, Gravel Bed River Floodplains, the Ecological Nexus. And in this paper, which has some fantastic diagrams, really great paper, they also call floodplains the most endangered landform. So when you think about working with endangered species that are dependent on endangered landforms, you really start getting a sense of the challenge we have in front of us. And then a couple years after that, in 2018, we have the paper that came out by Powers and others on this kind of process-based approach to getting to stage zero. So actually kind of the practice of how we do this. And later, I think that about that same year, Morgan Bond and others wrote a paper about the importance of floodplain reconnection in the Columbia River for Chinook. And now we're seeing papers kind of coming out all over the West, certainly, but around the world of how important floodplains are for fish and other aquatic species. And at about that same time, Colin and I published a paper on the stream evolution triangle. What you saw just at the end of his talk is really getting at the importance of biology. How we talk a lot about geology and hydrology. That's that kind of transport channel, how to move sediment. This is bringing in biology as a full partner, as a full driver. So that's really the emphasis of that paper, which was followed the next year by a paper with Matt Johnson as the first author on biomic river restoration, again, focusing on biology is kind of the new paradigm in river management, which seems kind of odd, but that I think is a big change. And then on the same day, in June of 2021, ironically, two papers came out, one by Damien and Jared and others, who you'll hear from today, on design criteria for process-based restoration in Doty Ravine, and also the paper by Ellen Wohl, myself, Brian Kluwer, Colin Thorne, Paul Powers, Dorothy Merritz, we mentioned, and Brian Staub. So I would definitely suggest that you take a look at these papers. I think it's a nice collection, but you don't have to go find them yourself. You can go to the Stage Zero Information Hub at stagezeroriverrestoration.com. They are all there with many of the papers, other papers and projects that you will be seeing today. So are we there yet? Any of you who have kids get that question all the time. Are we there yet? It would be nice to say we're there or we're getting close. But having spent so many years in restoration, we're not there. I don't think we'll ever be there. I think for us in the restoration community, we need to keep searching, keep pushing. What's next? How do we improve? How do we get better? Thank you.
Thanks, Janine. I'm going to interject a quick question because I didn't quite follow something in your presentation, and I think it just might help set our observers up to understand what you were showing. I didn't catch the name of the creek, but it was the one in, you said, Central Coast of Oregon. There's the guy standing there in the, I don't quite get what you did. What happened to change that? Or is that going to come later in the talk?
Yes. So that, hopefully I'm correct on this. I talked to Colin, and this afternoon he will be covering that talk.
Okay.
So hopefully that sets you up. You'll hear more about 5 Mile Bell. It's very much like I showed Karnowski Creek, where it was the meandering channel that was essentially filled up. That ditch was filled up. There was a new channel that was built adjacent to it. But it was this evolution through different kind of design approaches, moving from the single thread meandering channel, moving to a multi-thread channel system. And this is an area, because of the multiple phases, we were able to learn by doing and apply that to the other reaches. Great question.
Yeah, no, I did appreciate that part. I just, on the first example, I think I understood, okay, I think I get how you got there. And the second one, I saw the before and after, but I thought, well, what got you to that? So if we're gonna touch on that through the course of the day, then we'll just wait for it.
Well, that was just a teaser for you.
All right, great.